Nobody told you this because it doesn't sound nice, but the truth is simple. Being too nice almost never creates desire, it creates comfort. And comfort, most of the time, doesn't hold anyone. While you try to please, respond quickly, always be available. Another guy, without saying much, occupies space in her mind, not because he's better, but because he understands something most people ignore. Attraction doesn't stem from total surrender. It stems from the perception of value. And value, by definition, needs scarcity. It seems counterintuitive, I know, but that's exactly what politics guided by reality, not by ideals, reveals when you start observing how people really behave. Not what they say, but what they feel. Now think about it. How many times have you been present, available, doing everything right, and yet you were ignored, while someone more distant, more unpredictable, harder to read, occupied space? That's not bad luck, that's the norm. The human brain doesn't cling to what's guaranteed, it clings to what it can lose. And this is where a principle that spans centuries comes in. The end justifies the means, as long as you understand the right means. It's not about manipulating or deceiving, it's about understanding the invisible mechanisms that govern attraction. Because, like it or not, it's better to be feared than loved, in the symbolic sense of being respected, noticed, desired, and not just accepted as a nice guy. And when you start to realize this, you stop chasing and you start to be remembered. And that's exactly what you're going to understand here. These aren't ready-made phrases or empty games. They are real behavioral patterns based on decisions rooted in real human nature. Triggers that, when used consciously, completely change how you are perceived. From how you give attention to how you position yourself, how you're absent, how you communicate, everything influences it. And when you master this, you no longer need to force anything, because people start reacting differently without you having to ask. But there's an important detail that almost no one tells you. Using these triggers without understanding the balance can destroy what you're trying to build. And that's why, throughout this video, each point will show you not only what, but mainly how to use them intelligently. If something inside you awakened while listening, don't ignore that feeling. This channel isn't about videos, it's about memories. Remember who you were before the fear, before the exhaustion, before the silence. Each new video here is a different reflection of your own soul, an invitation to understand what the world never taught you. The power you seek outside has always been within you. If you feel that this journey speaks to what lives silently within you, sign up now. Not to follow yet another creator, but to reconnect with something the world tried to make you forget. Because here, every word was made to heal, each reflection to awaken, and each video serves as a reminder. You are not alone on the path back to yourself. Click on subscribe and turn the algorithm into a daily reminder of who you really are. He learned early on something most people ignore. What is given all the time loses value. It sounds harsh, but it's a truth that spans centuries, something Niccolo Machiavelli already suggested when discussing power and perception. When someone offers constant attention, unfiltered, without criteria, without rhythm, the other person simply stops perceiving it as something special. That's where the logic of politics guided by reality, not ideals, comes in. It's not about being cold, but about understanding how people really react. He doesn't ignore them, he's not gratuitously distant, he's simply not always available. And that changes everything, because deep down, the human brain values more what seems scarce. It's like a rare product. If it's always there, it loses its shine. So he moderates, he responds, but not immediately. He shows interest, but doesn't give everything at once. And in this silent game, without needing to say anything, he activates an ancient principle. The end justifies the means, provided the means are emotional intelligence, not disrespect. And curiously, the less he tries to prove his worth, the more he is perceived as someone of value. Not because he said so, but because he demonstrated it through the absence of excess. And that opens up space for something even more interesting. In everyday life, this translates into small, practical actions. For example, instead of always responding to a message in seconds, he sometimes waits, not as a childish game, but as a strategy of presence. He has things to do, he has a life, and this is reflected. If she sends something at night, he can respond with quality the next day, showing real attention, not anxiety. This is constant adaptability. Another point, when he's with her, he's truly present. He looks her in the eye, listens, validates. But afterwards, he doesn't constantly try to start a conversation. He leaves space, and this space creates an echo, because when attention isn't constant, it starts to be remembered. And here's a subtle detail. He validates, but not excessively. He doesn't praise everything, he doesn't agree with everything. He chooses what he validates. This is calculated use of force, only here, emotional force. And this selection makes each validation carry more weight. It's not about manipulation, it's about not trivializing. And when someone starts to miss his presence, without realizing it, they've already entered the field where scarcity generates value. But that's just the beginning, because maintaining that attention doesn't just depend on quantity, it depends on how it's delivered. And this is exactly where many go wrong. They think attention is just about being there, but he understands that attention is perception. It's like an emotional currency, and he doesn't distribute it indiscriminately. He observes, reads the environment, understands the moment. This is decisions based on real human nature. If she shows interest, he reciprocates, but without exaggeration. If she withdraws, he doesn't desperately chase after her. He maintains his posture, his masculine energy, his firmness. Because he knows that it's better to be feared than loved in a symbolic sense. It's better to be respected than merely available. And of course, always taking care to avoid being hated. No extreme coldness or artificial disinterest. It's a fine, almost invisible balance, an appearance of virtue that hides a well-defined strategy. He's not playing games, he's positioning himself. And when this positioning begins to take effect, something curious happens. She starts thinking about him more than he thinks about her. And then, another element comes into play that makes everything even more powerful. Something that breaks patterns and keeps her mind occupied even when he's not around. He realized something few dare to admit. What captivates the mind isn't constant presence, it's mystery. Predictability, however comfortable it may seem, dulls interest. Unpredictability, on the other hand, awakens it. And here enters a point that directly relates to virtu and fortuna, the ability to act intelligently within chaos. He isn't inconsistent, he doesn't change his personality, but he isn't entirely predictable either. One day he's more present, the next more silent. One day he responds with depth, the next with lightness. This isn't a lack of consistency, it's strategy. Because when someone can predict exactly how you're going to act, the game is over before it even begins. And he understands this. He doesn't deliver a ready-made script. He keeps the curiosity alive. And deep down, this touches on something very primitive. The human brain seeks patterns, and when it doesn't find them, it persists. It thinks more, analyzes more, gets more involved. And without realizing it, she begins to try to decipher him. And at that moment, he no longer needs to chase after her, because her mind is already working for him. This is politics guided by reality, not by ideals, understanding how human behavior really works, and using that knowledge intelligently. In practice, this manifests in simple yet extremely effective actions. For example, he doesn't always have the same tone of voice. Sometimes he's more playful, sometimes more profound, sometimes more direct. He creates variations, not out of confusion, but out of mastery. Another example, he might suggest something unexpected, a different place, an unusual topic, a question no one would ask. While most follow the pattern, he breaks it. And this creates contrast. And contrast generates attention. He also doesn't always react the same way to situations. If something deviates from the expected, he doesn't go into automatic mode. He observes, adjusts, and responds intelligently. This is constant adaptability. And here's an important detail. He doesn't seek approval. He doesn't mold his behavior to please. He maintains his essence, but varies his expression. This conveys presence, confidence, and above all, authenticity. And when someone is unpredictably authentic, they become memorable. Because the brain doesn't store what's common, it stores what deviates from the norm. And when she starts remembering him at random moments, it's no longer a coincidence. But there's an even deeper level to all of this, because unpredictability isn't just about behavior, it's about emotion. He doesn't overreact, nor does he react completely neutrally. He calibrates. Sometimes he shows more interest, sometimes less. Sometimes he opens up, sometimes he keeps his distance, and this creates a dynamic that keeps the other person engaged. Not out of toxic anxiety, but out of genuine curiosity. He knows that the end justifies the means, as long as those means respect boundaries and don't cross into destructive manipulation. He uses the calculated use of emotional force, not to confuse, but to keep the game alive. And always with the care to avoid being hated, because uncontrolled unpredictability becomes instability, and that pushes people away. The secret lies in balance. He's not chaotic, he's strategic. And when that strategy starts to work, something even more powerful comes into play. Something that doesn't depend on what he does, but on what he fails to do. Something that creates absence and transforms that absence into a constant mental presence. There comes a moment when he understands something that completely changes the game. It's not presence that creates impact, it's the lack of it. And this may sound counterintuitive at first, but it's one of the purest applications of politics, guided by reality, not by ideals. Because in practice, people don't value what is always available, they value what can be lacking. And that's where strategic absence comes in. He doesn't disappear out of insecurity, nor for childish games. He withdraws intentionally. He understands that when he's always there, accessible, predictable, constant, he ceases to be perceived as someone with intrinsic value. And this has nothing to do with disinterest. It has to do with positioning. He has his life, his goals, his own loyal armies, his priorities, his focus. And when he steps away, even for a short time, he creates a void, and the void echoes. Her mind begins to fill that space. What is he doing? Why didn't he show up? Could something have happened? And without realizing it, she begins to think about him more than he thought about her. This isn't luck. It's Virtu and Fortuna working together. In everyday life, this translates very practically. He's not available 24/7. He doesn't always respond immediately. He doesn't start conversations every day. Sometimes he simply doesn't show up. And most importantly, without explanation. Because when someone needs to justify every absence, it loses its impact. Silence, when used well, speaks louder than any message. This is calculated use of force. Only here, the force lies in absence. A simple example. After an intense conversation, instead of continuing to fuel it endlessly, he disappears for a while. He lets the experience breathe. Another example. If she shows constant interest, he doesn't immediately reciprocate with the same intensity. He balances it. This is constant adaptability, and this balance creates something powerful: anticipation. Because when someone doesn't know exactly when you'll show up again, each reappearance gains weight. It's no longer common. It becomes an event. And this silently but profoundly affects the perception of value. And the most curious thing is that he doesn't need to do anything extraordinary, just know when not to. But there's a fine line here that separates strategy from immaturity. He doesn't disappear irresponsibly, doesn't completely ignore, doesn't create unnecessary confusion. He understands that it's better to be feared than loved, in the symbolic sense of respect and presence, but always taking care to avoid being hated. Because excessive absence breeds rejection, not interest. The secret lies in the dosage. He disappears, but returns. He creates space, but doesn't break the connection. It's almost like an emotional breath. He approaches, moves away, approaches again, and in this rhythm he maintains control of the dynamic without seeming to be controlling it. This is the appearance of virtue. Everything seems natural, but there's awareness behind it. And when this absence begins to have an impact, something even more refined comes into play. Something that doesn't depend on disappearing or appearing, but on deeply understanding what the other person feels, often before they even realize it themselves. And that's when the game stops being merely strategic and begins to become almost psychological. He understood that there's a level of connection that goes beyond presence, words, or even absence. It's the level where you see what the other person feels, even before they can explain it. That's emotional mirroring. And there are no cheap tricks here. There's real skill. It's one of the few tools that doesn't depend on games, but on perception. He observes, listens, interprets. While many are preoccupied with speaking, he's paying attention to the tone of voice, the pauses, the subtle contradictions. And when he speaks, he doesn't try to impress, he reflects. He names what she's feeling. Something like, "It seems like you were a little confused by that, right? Or you speak as if this bothered you more than you want to admit." And at that moment, something changes. Because few people do this. Most ignore or invalidate emotions. He does the opposite. He brings them to the surface. This creates a deep connection. This is decisions based on real human nature, because every human being wants to be understood, truly. And when someone feels seen, they get closer. Not through effort, but through identification. In practice, this requires training, not talent. He's not born knowing. He develops it. He starts by observing more and reacting less. Instead of responding automatically, he pauses and thinks, what is she really feeling behind this? For example, if she complains about something small, he doesn't just respond to the problem. He looks for the emotion behind it. Maybe it's not about the fact itself, but about frustration, insecurity, tiredness. And he verbalizes this carefully. This creates a powerful effect. She feels understood without needing to explain everything. And this generates trust. Another example. When she tells him something positive, he doesn't respond with something generic like cool or that's good. He delves deeper. It seems like that gave you a sense of accomplishment, right? He amplifies the emotion. This is calculated use of force. But here, the force lies in empathy. And curiously, the more he demonstrates this ability, the more she opens up. And the more she opens up, the more he understands. And this creates a cycle of connection that is difficult to break. And at that point, he no longer needs to compete for attention. He already occupies emotional space. But here's the detail that few realize. This skill, when combined with strategy, becomes extremely powerful. Because he not only understands, he chooses when to use that understanding. He doesn't validate everything nor all the time. He knows that it's better to be feared than loved, in the sense of not being totally predictable emotionally. Sometimes he reflects, sometimes he confronts gently, sometimes he welcomes, sometimes he questions. This maintains balance. He doesn't become a worthless, constant emotional support. He takes a stand. This is virtu and fortuna, knowing how to act precisely at the right moment. And always with the care to avoid being hated, never invalidating aggressively, never disrespecting. He maintains the appearance of virtue, but with strategic awareness behind it. And when this emotional connection is already established, there is an almost imperceptible transition that can happen, because whoever understands emotions also understands fears. And among all fears, there is one that, when touched subtly, completely changes the dynamics of any relationship. There's a sensitive point that affects almost everyone, even those who seem most secure: the fear of losing connection. He doesn't talk about it openly, doesn't point it out, doesn't expose it, but he understands it. And understanding is already half the battle. Because when someone feels emotionally involved, any sign of possible separation activates something deep. It's not drama, it's biology, it's history, it's accumulated experience. And this is where the most delicate application of politics guided by reality, not by ideals, comes in. He creates connection first. He listens, validates, gets closer, generates identification. And when that connection begins to solidify, he doesn't give himself completely. He maintains a slight distance, nothing exaggerated, nothing artificial, just enough to leave a little doubt in the air. And that doubt keeps the mind active. That's virtu and fortuna working together. Because it's not enough to create connection. You need to know how to sustain the emotional tension without breaking it. And in that space between proximity and possible absence, the most intense interest is born. In practical behavior, this appears in almost invisible details. He may demonstrate genuine interest, create good moments, deep conversations, but he doesn't position himself as someone completely available or guaranteed. For example, after a very good date, he doesn't send a barrage of messages trying to prolong the feeling. He lets her miss him. Another example. If she starts to show greater attachment, he doesn't immediately increase his attention proportionally. He maintains his pace. This is constant adaptability. He doesn't react impulsively. He responds consciously. And this creates an emotional contrast. She feels closeness, but also perceives that he is not totally in control. And this activates attention. It's not about cruelly manipulating fear, it's about not completely eliminating the possibility of loss. Because when there is no risk, there is no perceived value. And when there is a slight uncertainty, involvement increases. This is calculated use of emotional force, applied with precision. But there's a responsibility here that few are mature enough to handle, because dealing with this type of emotion requires balance. He understands that better to be feared than loved doesn't mean causing constant insecurity. It means not being predictable to the point of being ignored, and always with the care to avoid being hated. He doesn't create excessive anxiety, doesn't disappear for long periods, doesn't generate unnecessary emotional confusion. He maintains a healthy, albeit strategic, game. This requires internal control. It requires masculine energy, firmness, decisiveness, self-control. He doesn't act out of neediness, doesn't desperately seek validation. He knows his worth, and this is reflected in how he positions himself. And when this balance begins to take hold, something even more visible comes into play. Because from that point on, it's no longer just about behavior or emotion. It's about presence, about how he is perceived when he enters a room, how he moves, how he speaks, and what that communicates without needing to say a single word. Even before he opened his mouth, He was already noticed, and that's no coincidence, it's constructed. He understood that presence isn't just about appearance, but about transmitted energy. There's something silent that communicates value before any word, and that's directly linked to how he positions himself in the world. Aligned shoulders, a firm gaze, unhurried movements. All of this sends signals. He doesn't try to attract attention, he sustains attention. And here comes a principle that many ignore. People don't listen to what you say first, they feel who you are. This is politics guided by reality, not by ideals. Because in practice, the world responds to perception, not intention. He may not be the richest, the most handsome, or the most popular, but he carries a posture that suggests control, direction, dominance. And this activates something automatic in people's minds: respect. And respect is the basis of everything. Because deep down, it's better to be feared than loved, in the symbolic sense of being taken seriously, not ignored. And when someone is perceived that way, they don't need to prove much. In everyday life, this translates into extremely concrete actions. He doesn't speak too fast, doesn't gesture uncontrollably, and doesn't constantly seek approval with his gaze. He speaks calmly, with pauses. He looks you in the eye, but without intimidating you. He listens without interrupting. This conveys confidence. Another point, he is mindful of his surroundings. If he arrives somewhere, he adapts without getting lost. If he's in a group, he doesn't try to be the center of attention, but he also doesn't fade into the background. He occupies space naturally. This is constant adaptability, and a detail that makes a big difference. He doesn't try to impress with words. He demonstrates through his behavior. For example, instead of saying he's busy, he's simply not available all the time. Instead of saying he's valuable, he acts like someone who is. This is calculated use of force, but here the force lies in the consistency between action and posture. And this consistency builds something that cannot be faked for long: credibility. But presence doesn't exist in isolation. It's directly connected to social perception. How he is seen by others, how he positions himself in different contexts, how he reacts under pressure. All of this makes up what we call status. And status isn't just money or fame, it's a perception of value. He understands this deeply. He knows that his own loyal armies aren't just people, but also habits, discipline, routine. He builds a life that sustains his posture, and it shows. He doesn't need to say he's in control, he demonstrates it. And always with the care to avoid being hated, no arrogance, no forced superiority. He maintains an appearance of virtue, but with real consistency behind it. And when this presence begins to be recognized, something interesting happens. Words begin to carry more weight. And this opens up space for an even more refined skill, because it's not just about what you say, it's about how you use what the other person has already said. He doesn't argue, he observes. And in that attentive silence, he gathers something far more valuable than arguments: patterns, because people reveal much more than they imagine when they speak. Contradictions, insecurities, desires, everything appears between the lines. And he understands this, not to attack, not to expose aggressively, but to position himself. He listens intentionally, and when he decides to speak, he doesn't create something from scratch. He uses what has already been said. This is decisions based on real human nature, because nobody likes to be confronted with external opinions. But when you show the inconsistency from the person's own words, the impact is different. It's harder to deny. Something like, "You said you don't like games, but what you did doesn't seem a bit like that." It's not an accusation, it's a reflection. And that disarms, because he's not imposing a view. He's mirroring an inconsistency. And at that moment, he takes control of the conversation without needing to raise his voice. This is calculated use of force. applied to communication. In practice, this requires mental presence. He needs to remember what was said, connect the dots, interpret nuances. For example, if she says she values sincerity but acts evasively, he doesn't ignore it. He calmly brings it up. Another example, if she claims she doesn't get attached easily but shows clear signs of involvement, he can comment lightly, "Funny, you said you don't get attached, but it seems you're more involved than you imagine." This isn't gratuitous provocation, it's strategic awareness. And this is where constant adaptability comes in. He adjusts his tone according to the context, sometimes more direct, sometimes more subtle. He doesn't seek to win the argument, he seeks clarity. And this generates respect, because few people have the courage to confront intelligently. Most avoid it or explode. He does things differently. He maintains emotional control, speaks firmly, without aggression. And this conveys something very powerful: mastery. Mastery of oneself, of the situation, of communication. And when someone demonstrates this, they automatically rise in the dynamic. But there is a limit that he respects precisely. He understands that better to be feared than loved doesn't mean humiliating or exposing the other person. The goal isn't to win, it's to align, and always with the care to avoid being hated. He doesn't use her words against her cruelly, nor in moments of vulnerability. He chooses when and how to act. That is virtù and fortuna, knowing how to act at the right time. He maintains an appearance of virtue, but with inner firmness. And when this skill begins to be perceived, something changes. She starts to think twice before speaking, and begins to take you more seriously, because she knows you truly listen. And this opens space for something even more essential, because it's no use mastering communication if you don't master yourself. And that's where an energy comes in that doesn't need to be explained, but is felt in every decision, in every posture, in every silence. He doesn't need to say he's in control. It's already perceived. There's an energy that doesn't come from words, but from decisions, and this energy is built in the silence of his own choices. He knows what he wants, he knows what he accepts, and most importantly, he knows what he doesn't accept. This conveys a firmness that doesn't depend on anyone's validation. And here comes an essential point of politics guided by reality, not by ideals. The world responds to those who take a stand, not to those who ask for permission. He doesn't wait for signals all the time. He doesn't live trying to interpret every detail in search of approval. He acts, he decides, he takes responsibility, and if he needs to correct his course, he corrects it. That is virtù and fortuna, acting with courage even without total control of the scenario. And when someone carries this energy, they don't need to chase after it, they attract it, because security is magnetic, and it has nothing to do with arrogance. It has to do with direction. He knows where he's going, even if he hasn't arrived there yet, and that in itself already differentiates him from most. In everyday life, this energy manifests in simple yet extremely revealing actions. He doesn't ask everything, he suggests. Instead of, "What do you want to do?" he says, "Let's go to that place I told you about." He leads. This isn't control over the other person, it's self-awareness. Another example, he doesn't change his opinion just to avoid conflict. If he disagrees, he speaks up, respectfully but firmly. This is the calculated use of force, the force of maintaining integrity. He also doesn't over-explain himself. If he did something, he owns it. If he disagrees, he stands by it. This conveys something rare, inner consistency, and this connects directly with constant adaptability, because he knows when to yield, but he doesn't bend. He adjusts without losing himself. And this balance creates a very strong perception. He is not easily influenced, and when someone is not easily influenced, they automatically become a reference point. And this completely changes the dynamics of any interaction. But perhaps the most important point here is emotional control. Because masculine energy isn't about dominating others, it's about dominating oneself. He doesn't react impulsively, doesn't get lost in momentary emotions, doesn't act out of neediness. He observes, processes, decides, and this requires maturity. He understands that better to be feared than loved isn't about causing fear. It's about not being ignored, not being discarded. It's about having presence. And always with the care to avoid being hated, nothing extreme rigidity, no unnecessary coldness. He maintains an appearance of virtue, but with real strength behind it. And when this energy begins to consolidate, something inevitable happens. He starts to establish boundaries naturally, without guilt, without fear, without the need to please. And that's exactly where the next piece comes in. Because without clear boundaries, any value he has built up to this point can simply dissolve. He reached a point where he no longer negotiates the essentials, and that changes everything, because ultimately what defines someone's worth isn't what they say, it's what they tolerate. He understood that self-esteem isn't about repeating pretty phrases in the mirror. It's about acting like someone who respects themselves, and this is reflected mainly in boundaries. He doesn't accept disrespect disguised as a joke. He doesn't ignore inconsistent attitudes. He doesn't remain in situations that diminish his value. This is politics guided by reality, not by ideals. Because in practice, people test limits all the time, consciously or unconsciously, and those who don't set those limits end up being molded by the behavior of others. He does the opposite. He sets the standard. And this doesn't come from aggression, nor from imposition. It comes from inner clarity. He knows who he is, what he wants, and what he doesn't accept. And this conveys something extremely rare: integrity. And when someone has integrity, they don't need to ask for respect. They naturally receive it. In practice, this appears in decisive moments. For example, if she cancels something at the last minute without justification, he doesn't react with anger, but he also doesn't pretend everything is fine. He might calmly say, "I prefer to make plans when there's a real commitment." Simple, direct, no drama. Another example, if she shows disinterest or disrespect, he doesn't try to compensate with more effort. He withdraws. This is calculated use of force, the force to retreat when necessary. He doesn't beg for attention. He doesn't try to convince someone to like him. He understands that his value doesn't depend on someone's approval. This is constant adaptability, knowing when to invest and when to exit. And this behavior creates a powerful effect. He becomes selective, and someone who is selective is perceived as someone of value because they don't accept just anything. And this completely changes how they are treated. But there's something even deeper here. Because boundaries aren't just about others, they're about oneself. He doesn't allow himself to fall into patterns he already knows don't work. He doesn't return to situations that have already shown their cost. He doesn't trade his peace for momentary attention. That's virtù and fortuna, the ability to act consciously even when emotion tries to dominate. He understands that it's better to be feared than loved, in the sense of being respected for his choices, not just accepted. And always with the care to avoid being hated, no extreme rigidity, no arrogance. He maintains an appearance of virtue, but with real consistency. And when someone positions themselves like that, something inevitable happens. The game changes, because now it's no longer about conquering, it's about choosing. And whoever learns to choose rarely returns to being treated as an option. Now let me ask you a direct question. How many times have you suppressed yourself trying to be accepted? How many times have you answered too quickly, given in too much, explained too much, and in the end, still felt like it wasn't enough? The truth is, As long as you don't understand how people really work, you'll continue playing a game where only you don't know the rules. And this isn't about becoming cold, distant, or manipulative. It's about awareness. About understanding that value isn't declared, it's demonstrated. And that often what you thought brought you closer was exactly what made you predictable. And predictability, when misused, silently kills interest. Now think, what if, starting today, you began to act differently? Not in a forced way, but consciously. By moderating your attention, controlling your presence, taking a firm stance, establishing clear boundaries, observing more than reacting. You don't need to change who you are, but you need to stop acting like someone who doesn't value themselves. Because the moment you understand this, something changes internally. And when you change internally, the external world responds. People start treating you differently, not because you asked, but because you started to position yourself differently. This is politics guided by reality, not by ideals. It's about stopping living in the should-be and starting to act based on what really works. So answer me honestly. Are you going to keep repeating the same patterns expecting different results? Or are you going to try something new? Are you going to keep chasing validation, or are you going to start building real value? Because nobody is going to do that for you. This kind of change isn't comfortable, but it's necessary. And if any part of this video bothered you, great. Maybe that's exactly where you need to look more closely. Now, if you want to keep evolving, understanding more about behavior, attraction, and positioning, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Because here, you won't find what sounds nice. You'll find what works.